Welcome to sunny Florida. It's another episode of the Lazy Boy Chronicles. One of the key important facts of understanding natura naturans, or Mother Nature used colloquially, is understanding what point source means. A laser is a near perfect analogy, not totally perfect, but I was taught, and I actually grew up with helium neon lasers, and I would build power supplies for them. I was one of those extreme science geeks. I had liquid nitrogen Dewar flasks, also even so-called superconductor sets, which were just magnets and yttrium, barium, copper oxide. I had a lot of mad scientist equipment at a very young age. And we were all taught, including me, incorrectly might I add, that light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation, i.e. a laser, is coherent light radiation. Well, that's actually not what a laser is, and of course I give this in the definitions, which is in the link below that I wrote, about what a laser truly is. What a laser truly is a point source field emission object. And of course, talk about light being a coaxial circuit, on and on, but we're talking about point source here. We are talking about something that is qualitatively different, but quantitatively identical. 5 watts of energy is 5 watts of energy, correct? Yeah? Well, a 5-watt light bulb, I think it's like a 60 watt over here, is useless. You can't even hardly read a book by a 5-watt light bulb, but a 5-watt laser will burn a hole in your fanny. It's dangerous. It will permanently blind you. Why is that? They're quantitatively identical light emissions. Well, that's coherent radiation. Well, attributionally and definitionally, correct and incorrect at the same time, but they're point source emissions. This is also too the reason why LED lights are really bad for your eyes, because they're actually quasi point source objects. This is the reason why 99% of the lasers used in objects are LED lasers. They're not chemical lasers. They're not gas tube lasers like the helium neons that I used to mess with. But a point source object is power directed from counter space. In understanding a point source object, we actually have to also understand incommensurability, and that's a difficult one that would take like about 6 videos and about 4 hours to explain. But I keep telling people, I was like, take your PhD professor of physics and mathematics, or just your professor at your college, say, what, sir, is it that defines a magnet? And I kid you not, I don't exaggerate when I say this, you will not get an answer out of any of them. And it's okay not to know the answer to something, but these people will make stuff up. So what is it that defines a magnet? Is it quantitative, qualitative, both, or neither? And, a magnet, before becoming a magnet, is quantitatively identical, as it is once it becomes a magnet. So if a magnet is only defined by its qualitative nature, what is the qualitative nature that defines a magnet, since it is not quantitative at all? When a samarium cobalt or a iron magnet or a neodymium iron boron becomes a magnet, what is it thence that it defines it being a magnet? Because the actual atomic structure of the of the neodymium iron boron or samarium cobalt is quantitatively identical. The only difference is quality. Same thing with a laser. This is the reason why I always use the laser analogy in referring to understanding, having a thought or mental image of understanding what actually defines a magnet. A pre-magnet, for example, would be a non-point source object, which is spatially collective. Okay, it's spatially collective. Like a light bulb, whether it be 5-watt light bulb or a 60-watt light bulb, is spatially collective. Or if you tie a bunch of sticks together, like the Roman fascia, that makes them a lot stronger than they are individually. The sum of the parts in that analogy of the fascia, where the sticks are tied together, are collectively more than the individual components of the sticks. So if you have 10 sticks tied together, which would be 10 units of strength to break them, now become greater than 10 to break them. So it's spatially collective. A point source object, however, is spatially divisive. Just think about that for a second. A point source object is spatially Divisive, that means directed away from space. Just think about that for a second. What actually defines a laser, which is a point source object? What defines a magnet, which is a point source object? Point source object is spatially divisive, which is only possible with a dielectric field. It's like, wait a minute, a magnet is about magnetism. That's true, but magnetism is the dielectric field. A point source magnetic field is the dielectric point source. Magnetism itself is the dielectric field, as I just said. The loss of energy is emanated from counter space and the plane of inertia, which you can easily see using supercell or even magnetic viewing film. And it's not located there. A magnet doesn't have poles, because if it had poles, there would be locations there and it would be divisible. But a magnet's polarity is not divisible, because you can slice it 1,000 times. In each little slice, if you could slice it, since they're actually ceramic and it's basically impossible to do, each little slice will have a, quote, north pole and south pole. You actually have to understand incommensurability and what actually defines the three-dimensional S-curve that defines force itself, specifically force in motion, i.e. centrifugal divergence, or the dielectric field. And one of the simplest analogies, and I met up with somebody recently at the photo walk, is like, I really understood it when you talked about what is the magnetism, it's a dielectric field. I didn't understand that at first until you mentioned, what's the distinction or disparity between ice, water, and steam. These are different terms applied to exactly the same thing. Ice, water, and steam, of course, are all water. Magnetism is just a stupid word dumb human beings contrived to refer to a specific field modality. But that specific field modality is just a modality of the dielectric, the loss of that energy or inertia, and the three-dimensional S-curve that defines what that unique phenomena is. But that phenomena is just an ether perturbation modality, and the dielectric field in simplex. Understanding point source and incommensurability is not that incredibly hard, but it requires a type of non-discursive intellection such you can abduct the nature of what incommensurability is and what defines a point source. I, like you, was brought up to believe the nonsense that, well, a laser is coherent light emission. And they also, too, told me that, well, the backside of the laser is 100% reflective, and the front mirror, in the case of like a tube laser, is 95% reflected. And what happens is when you apply the power source, the light bounces back and forth infinitely, and then eventually shoots out the mirror that is only 90. And it's completely ridiculous. That's not what happens in a laser. When you turn on a laser, that specific geometry that defines the laser, in the case of a helium neon tube laser, for example, sets up the condition whereby which light is emitted as a point source. Say a 5-watt helium neon laser, of which I've owned many and built several of them, power supplies for anyway. That's a point source object. A magnet is the qualitative nature of a point source object, wherein everything is operating collectively, from which, as I said, a point source is spatially divisive. A non-point source, like the Roman fascia, for example, is spatially collective. So spatially collective versus spatially divisive. And something that is spatially divisive is emanating from counter space. That's correct. Power directed from counter space. Power directed from counter space is a point source field or point source emission. Whether we talk about the laser, we're talking about the magnet, it's a point source emission. I hope that clears up point source sum. It's kind of a obtuse topic to talk about, and I actually like talking about topics that nobody else on YouTube is talking about. But nobody could understand the nature of a magnet and understand the nature of a laser without understanding what point source field energy is. And I've mentioned this in video years ago, that all future amazing technology will be point source field inventions. It all will be. The really, really amazing stuff. I know for a fact the so-called anti-gravity is a point source omnidirectional field that's generated respective to the vector of acceleration. I know that knowing the right-hand rule and what the right-hand rule is, that's the only way it can work. It's the same reason I invented that little toy of mine. I invented 3 of them. And, I spent dozens of hours messing with that little toy. It's just kind of fascinating. Eventually, I'd like to one day build a mock-up, if I ever have the time and the money to do that. But all the amazing stuff that has sprung technology forward has been point source objects. Think about every amazing piece of tool and tech that we have. They rely primarily on 2 different types of point source field object phenomena. One's a magnet, and one's a laser. If you had any idea how much lasers define everything we use and do on it, it's absolutely astronomical. The same thing with magnets. Magnets allow the existence, TVs, radios, iPads, iPhones, everything, your car, everything requires a magnet. These are all point source objects. So understanding the nature of point source field phenomena is incredibly important. Anyway, that's been another episode of the Lazy Boy Chronicles. I'll be back on Sunday.